Greetings, my name's Andrew Sumner. My grandfather, Pop Smythe, bought me my first comic book in Liverpool, England, when I was 3 years old, and I spent the next 50 years hurtling around the pop culture kaleidoscope, first as a fan, and then as a journalist, editor, publisher and presenter. Along the way, I met a bunch of interesting people who will be joining me here, creators, performers, professionals and public servants. We live in divisive, fractured times, but art and popular culture connect people from all viewpoints and from all walks of life. I'm often struck by the passions people enjoy, that they can set aside their differences for and agree on whatever those passions are, whether I share them or not. And that spark, that moment of instinctive, connective agreement, that's what I call a hard agree.
Well, actually, I'm just taking care of a couple of commission pieces right now that I'm finishing up and getting those out of the way. Preparing to work on a little book with a character that I've been using recently called the Littlest Plague Doctor.
Oh, and yeah, I've seen those illustrations. They're great.
Yeah, and so I'm working with writer J.D. Faulkson, and what we're going to be doing is a little bit of a storybook featuring a day in the life of the Doctor, and it's just going to be like a little village, and it's just a day of him making house calls, walking through the village, and sort of a wind in the willows sort of thing, but a little bit of our take on that sort of thing, and it's really actually kind of quaint, but it's something that I'm actually looking forward to. I always enjoyed the like the E.B. Shepherd illustrations, for the original One in the Willows. So something in that kind of thing. So I'm kind of gearing up to get started on that very shortly, along with a host of other things. But today that's been kind of what I've been focused on.
Okay. And where did the Littlest Plague Doctor come from? What was your inspiration?
Well, I've been working with Evelyn Crete over at Wildside Press, and her and I have been talking about working on a number of projects, including with writer J.D. Faulkson, who writes a series of books called the Ouroboros Cycle, which is just shorthand is a series of novels that involve like this group of vampires in like the late 1800s around the Russian mountains, that sort of thing. And it's very oh gosh, I don't know the best way to describe it, but it's very lavish and it's very opulent, I guess is the best way to put it. And it's these various kingdoms that are sequestered among this mountain range between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And so at any rate, I'm going to be doing a graphic novel adaptation of a chapter from the first book in the series, which involves a group of the vampires kind of on a hunt. And again, they're quite elegant in their dress and their manner, and they're kind of on a horseback ride through the snow and mountains, chasing the scions, which are these kind of like half wolf, half human creatures that are, extremely violent, as opposed to this vampire group that is much more sophisticated. And so it's really an opportunity to do some nice illustrative work, with the snow and the horses and all that sort of thing. And I'm very excited about it, and Jeff's a fantastic writer. But at any rate, as we were developing this graphic novel, which I'll be actually starting on later this year, we wanted to start doing some things to get the whole process of the Kickstarters and crowdfunding and kind of get a sense of how we were going to work together in that sense. And we came up with this Littlest Plague Doctor character as kind of like a little test project. And it's one of those things where it started out as a discussion, and then I did a sketch, and then it started to take on a life of its own, as these things tend to do.
Right on.
And so the next thing we did the initial project with the little sticker and a few little mini prints using quotes from like Edgar Allan Poe and Emerson, and then we did a cloth patch and another cloth patch. And in the development of all this, we talked about doing an actual story. And again, it's interesting how things will start as a germ of an idea. And once given time, it starts to actually, it starts to grow. And some things, they go so far, and then it's kind of like it's like, well, that's not really going to go anywhere. But with something like this, it just kind of seems to, as we were doing these little projects and getting reactions from people that were, wanting the little prints and the patches and such, and like, well, we want to see more of this character, and we'd love to see a story about this character. And then you start to, and so that's kind of an interesting process for me to have, like, usually you come up with something with the editor and and there's a certain project that you're assigned. And this is something that is kind of evolving in public, so it's a fun little project. And so that's where that's at this point. So,
I mean, you're absolutely right. As a lover and observer of your work, and you and I connected in a number of ways. But I've observed as a result of that the growth and the success of the Littlest Plague Doctor, and watching the character take on a life of its own over the last 18 months or so. And it's really been very fascinating to observe. And as a creator, it must be interesting when you come up with something, something comes out of your cerebellum like that, and it then takes on a life of its own, quite beyond what you expected. I always think that must be a very interesting journey to go through as a creator.
Yeah, I've been, and it's interesting because you can work night and day to conceive of something that and get pages of notes and designs and characters and such, and then you put all this intensity into it, and then it's almost like it's almost a little too heavy for the person, for the group that you want to get it out there for. And then you come up with something, like, at least in my case, you come up with something that's kind of light, and you have a little bit of affection for it, and it's a little bit light, and then that immediately it registers with people, and it's an interesting process. It's not the first time that has happened, I think, with various creators, where they have something that they do kind of on a whim, and then it's the thing that registers with people, this little sketch or doodle or something like that, and it grows from there. So it's always good to learn, and for me, it's a learning process. This particular little project has been a learning process because, as you know, with my work, I'll get involved with some very, very labor intensive projects in terms of the content, the adaptations, the illustrations, and all that sort of thing. So there's something nice. I love doing things that are planned out and thought out, but it's also nice to do something that's kind of spontaneous, and has this kind of like quick, delivery.
Of course. And that must be a delight for you, being somebody who is a very detailed creator, and you really deep dive into those projects, which can take years to manifest and create. Having something else that you can mix up your time with, I can absolutely see the value in that, and how that must bring a level of balance and sanity almost to your kind of, perspective to your creative.
Yeah. And, I think what's interesting too is it's something that kind of spontaneity, there's an outlet for that with, the world of social media that I don't think we really had access to before, where it's
Very
like,
true.
In the case of being an artist, I think where you can kind of improvise creatively in public, and you can form something in a way that in the past it would have to be, you come up with your designs, you get approved, you find a publisher, you go to press, and then you see how it goes from there. Yeah. But, again, one of the positive uses I think that people can find creatively in social media, I mean this for young people starting out and all that, it's almost like, if you think of it in this way, the opportunities are so vast, to anyone, because if you've got an idea one night, you can do that little doodle, you can post it online, a few catchphrases, and, who knows? You get 5 people interested, 10 people interested, and then it just starts to evolve. And I think that part is new. I don't think that is something that was really available to artists the way it is now, to artists and writers and creators and that sort of thing. So.
I think that's very well said. I think it's the supreme interactivity of the social media world in which we live now, which, men of our age, people of our age often have, observe upon the various downsides of that, but there are tremendous upsides to it. And that level of interactivity and the dialogue you can have with fans of your work and people who are interested in what you create, I think that's it's on an unparalleled level of interactivity that there's never existed before. And I think most of that is a very positive thing if you control it properly.
Yes. Yeah. So, It's funny. I have a real fondness, I guess, romantic notion of what it was like in the early days of television.
Yeah.
And where you've got a limited budget, a limited broadcast range, and that people would improvise to create material to put on the air. And it was just. And I'm a big fan of that kind of the kind of ingenuity that comes out of the restraints of having a very limited area to work with, but you've got this potential of reaching an audience.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's interesting to go back and look at the early days of television, especially the early days of animated cartoons specifically for television.
Yeah.
Where they would come up with, like the original, like this is, the Crusader Rabbit's one that comes to mind, or the early Bullwinkle cartoons, where they were very limited in their abilities of what they could do with the animation, but they balanced that out with having very, very solid writing and great voice actors, for example. And I think that's something, again, that could carry over in different levels in today's internet.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I think it's fascinating the way that animation itself went on this journey from television animation. So you get the limited animation of the early 50s, mid 50s, early 60s, with the reduced frame rate and the huge India ink lines that you would see around the characters, which look beautiful in and of themselves, but are a departure from the lush illustration of Hanna-Barbera's work at MGM or the Termite Terrace guys at Warner Brothers. But those really heavy rendering lines. But there's something beautiful about it, to the point that as animation then progressed, and then you get into the Xerox era of the 70s, where something was truly lost and the art of it was radically reduced. Still some great voice actors, but for example, what's great about Scooby-Doo is the title sequence. If you watch the episode, you are seeing the same episode 52 times over, right? It's just the same thing again, with many of the same shots, reused. But I think then you get into the era of like the early 2000s, and people like, say, the creators of the Powerpuff Girls, the creators of Dexter's Laboratory, Craig McCracken, Gendy Tartakovsky, they're going back to that India ink look, which they're rendering and creating in a different way using modern technology, but they're embracing the beauty of those early cartoons, and they truly are beautiful.
Yeah, agreed. So I guess, so I don't know, maybe in a year or so, maybe you'll see some animated Little Plague Doctor material up online. Who knows,
John, I can't wait. And that is as good a point as any to say, welcome to Hard Agree. My name is Andrew Sumner, and I'm here with my friend John K Snyder III, the incredible illustrator, author, comic book artist, storyteller that is John K Snyder III, a man whose work I've loved for actually a very long time. And actually, John, you and I are almost the same age. And before we talk about your career, where you've created some books that I love, Suicide Squad. You've been involved in Suicide Squad. You've been involved in that beautiful version of Doctor Mid-Nite. And funnily enough, the last person I spoke to for the show was your co-creator on that and on Grendel, Matt Wagner. I spoke a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you've also created one of my favorite graphic novel of the last 10 years, and one of my favorite graphic novels of all time, your adaptation of the great Lawrence Block's 8 Million Ways to Die, which I'd like to get into with you. But before we talk about all that, how did you first encounter comics and comic book culture, mate?
Oh boy, that's a great question. And it's funny. You mean going back to like when I was a kid? Yeah.
Absolutely,
Well, like you said, we're from the same era. And, we were in a very interesting time as kids, because I was 5 years old in 1966.
Yeah.
And 1966 is kind of a watermark year for a number of things. You had, getting back to animation for a bit, that was when they first had in America here, they had actual cartoons produced specifically for Saturday morning. And I think that was the guy at NBC, Fred Silverman's idea, I think, is from what I've read. And the big lead tune was Space Ghost, and which everybody knows from Cartoon Network, Coast to Coast. But it was like a serious show, and it was designed by Alex Toth, and I didn't know any of this at 5 years old.
Yeah.
But I knew that Space Ghost was coming to Saturday morning. I can still remember seeing the first commercial for it. And it was shocking because there was nothing other than, which were great, the reruns of the old Tom and Jerry and Bugs Bunny and all that, but there was nothing adventure. There was Johnny Quest, but it was, and that was unbelievable too, but it wasn't like something like Space Ghost, in terms of appealing to a kid, the guys flying around and spaceships and all that sort of thing. But you had Space Ghost and you had the Batman show, Adam West and all those great characters. You had Star Trek was it was on later at night, so I didn't quite catch it, but you knew it was there.
Yeah.
Green Hornet. Oh boy, I'm kind of.
And there's all the Irwin Allen shows from that period of time as well.
Yes.
So Lost in Space, Land of the Giants.
Yeah, Wild Wild West. I mean, it was, and and you also in the background you had the James Bond stuff, which again was for adults. But you had that spillover into television. So you had like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And here we were getting Patrick McGowan's show, Danger Man. It was called Secret Agent.
Right on. Yeah.
And again,
with that great Johnny Rivers theme tune you guys had.
Yeah. But at the same time, even though in my early, and like after 5, and this stuff was on, from I'd say from 5 to 10 years old. I mean, it was just like an avalanche of this material. And again, things like Danger Man would come on in syndication. So it'd pop up on a Saturday afternoon on occasion. It was like, wow, what's it? And it was, again, I couldn't quite grasp what it was about, but I knew it was cool,
Yeah.
And so, when I talk about my interests, a lot of them do tend to lean into, like animation, movies, television series, that sort of thing. As far as the comic books go, I love them as well, of course, because they were the most accessible thing, because the shows were on and very limited, but you could always get your hand on a comic book. And I was very fortunate in that my father's younger brothers were only in their teens at the time. And they loved Marvel Comics, and they were picking up some of the original, the original late 60s runs. Yeah. And I would get to go over and read them or get a few of them. But if I was going to go like pinpoint certain books that I still remember to this day, I think the first comic that I remember having a huge impact on me, again, because of the Batman craze, they were releasing so much Batman material at that time that there was a reissue. I learned later this was a reissue, but they put out a 3D Batman comic.
Yeah.
And it was it came with 3D glasses, and it was reprinting some of the old 50s stories. So it was that very hard-edged, stylistic artwork. So
it's like sort of almost the Dick Sprang era kind of where Batman has the massive shoulders and
and Sheldon Moldoff, I think.
Moldoff, of course. Yeah.
So, and again, I didn't know any of this as a kid, but I just knew that in 3D with the glasses, with that kind of hard-edged illustration, it was really deep. I mean, it looked like the characters were just jumping off the page, right? And I think looking back, I think that particular comic, my dad picked it up for me, had a huge impact on me because it just gave me the impression of characters leaping off of the page, And I think I look at some of my work to this day, and I'm always trying to get my characters outside of the borders,
Yeah, no, right on.
I think to some degree it may have come from that initial exposure. But
Can I ask a question? Some of your work, I think, one of the things that's kind of unique about your work, a unique flavor that your work has, is that some of it has this almost kind of spectral angularity about it, where on the one hand there's almost like there's almost like it would be like watching, say, a cameraman like Jeffrey Unsworth, who shot the original Superman, the Dick Donner Superman, Dick Donner, may rest in peace. And with that sort of fantastic haziness to it, I sometimes find with your work, particularly some of your covers, it's got this brilliant kind of spectral haze while also being quite angular in its delivery. And I find it very, very hypnotic to look at. I might not be using brilliant terms to describe my experience here, but you're getting some flavor of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate. Thank you for the summation of the look of my work. And I it's not so much deliberate. It's just kind of developed that way,
Yeah.
And I think that it comes from a variety of influences, and it comes and it's a way that, and it's interesting because it is kind of a juxtaposition of, with kind of the haze and the mist and all that. That's kind of to give things kind of a depth. But then it's countered by like these hard-edged, like with the very square shoulders and jutting jaws and that sort of thing. But I think that on one level, for me, it is to help create an immediate sense of dimension, and it can be kind of jarring, I think, to some people because it comes across in a highly stylistic way. And I do love illustration. I love classic illustration, and I'm a big fan of that sort of thing. But for me, artistically, I think that I've always had a strong reaction to stuff that's more. It's almost like, I guess the best way to put it is, since it is two-dimensional, it is created on a two-dimensional plane. That there's no limit to representation, and sometimes I find that literal representation is almost repetitive in terms of, we're already there, we see that in the real world, so I kind of like the idea of something that's more stretched out and kind of surrealistic, because I think you can hit more of an emotional sense. And I do think that part of that comes from, even going back to when I was a kid, having a reaction to, I was very lucky in that, I had a lot of exposure to fine art in my later teen years, because at that point in my life, I was living in the DC area, and I was able to go down to the National Mall or the National Galleries and see like Van Gogh and a number of other artists, like German Expressionism, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And that really appealed to me. Also, but at the same time, I had exposure to that as a kid, too, because I would look in an issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland and see a still of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which had a huge influence on me. I can remember when I was a little kid, I had in a music class, we had a little book with the chords and all that stuff, but they would have fine art paintings in them. And I have very distinct memory of two in particular, which was The Three Musicians by Picasso, which is literally just almost like, it looks like cutouts, but it's bold and it's bright. And then there was a Chagall painting of a fiddler. He's in green, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name quite this moment, but again, Chagall, the same thing, where he would have, these kind of blurry backgrounds and then these kind of hard, sharp images. And I'm not trying to sound overtly sophisticated or anything. I'm just saying that this is what appealed to me. It's just kind of
I think you're inherently sophisticated, mate. That's the thing. And it's so interesting to you talk about this, because now that I've heard you quote those references, it makes complete sense to me that they were among your inspirations, because I can see that through line. And absolutely the German Expressionism, and also some of the German propaganda art from the early 30s. All of those elements I can see in your work.
It's funny because, again, going back to when I was a kid, I was really responsive to all the, all the fun, the comics and the stuff going on with with TV and animation and all that sort of thing. But as I got into my teen years, I still loved comics very much. But at the same time, I found myself really wanting to get more into, like I said, not so much fine art, but I was interested in illustration and, like Mondrian and again, I was more interested in art with a kind of a theme. And so the whole thing with the angular artwork and how it would be in certain time periods, Art Deco was extremely appealing. But at the same time, too, if you go back to the 70s, as I was getting into my teen years, that was very popular in illustration. And there were a lot of illustrators, and I was very interested in illustration. And you had guys from that period that were starting to, even though they were working in an illustration style, they were still doing things that were very, very angular. And they were going back to like Linedecker. For example, I think, what was the Alice Cooper record cover? Welcome to My Nightmare, where he's got the top hat?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was that had a huge impact on me in terms of the rendering, where you had him kind of photorealistically rendered in one sense, but in the other, there was these cutting lines for like the highlights and the top hat, the hands and all that sort of thing. And I loved all that kind of stuff too, so I would try to incorporate a little bit of that as well.
And that's a kind of beautifully circular reference, because one of Alice's great inspirations was a famous Monsters of Film man. He's a big fan.
Oh, really?
And comic books, yeah. I interviewed him for Forbidden Planet TV about a year ago, and he's a big fan. When he's in London, that's the store that the company I work for owns in the UK. It's a really well-known comic book store.
Wow.
It's one of the biggest comic book stores in the world. But every time he comes to London, he visits. And one of the things he was talking about is absolutely his whole stage act is directly influenced by Forrest J. Ackerman, by Universal movies, and by comic books. Yeah, so isn't it interesting that you should reference that?
That's really well. Alice Cooper was a big. I mean, I loved Alice Cooper.
Oh, he's the man. Yeah,
sure. And still do. But I can't miss talking about childhood influences without mentioning something we both love, which is Yellow Submarine.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. So Yellow Submarine was a major influence on me as a kid. And it was funny because it didn't actually get to see the movie. It was funny at that time. It's hard to understand now because, it wasn't like every movie was accessible, you know? And, but I had the Gold Key comic, and I had the paperback, which had reprinted. There was a paperback that reprinted stills from the movie and such. And I was just absolutely just enamored of the look of Yellow Submarine, the design, the way the color was used. And at the time I knew a little bit about Peter Max. I had a Peter Max paper airplane book, which I thought was great as a kid. Right. And that kind of look, I know Peter Max, I don't believe he is actually directly involved with Yellow Submarine. It's a different group, but it had that similar kind of feel to it. But the thing about Yellow Submarine that I really liked was I loved the villains, the way the bad guys.
Oh yeah,
the one guy, Jack. I can't remember his full name, but his hands were like little snapping like creatures at the end of his hands, and you had giant apple.
The snapping turtle Turk. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And you had the giant apple bonkers. The guy.
For sure.
Long top hats.
Yeah.
With the long top hats and the big giant apples they would drop on people, and the flying glove, with the sneer and all that. So, that was really cool to me because you had this kind of surrealist, again, it looked like comic. It had a comic sense to it, but it also had you had this kind of surrealism, and it was this certain level, this depiction of good and evil, and these bright colors, and that was kind of, again, it was that thing again of no limit. There's no limit. If you want to draw little creatures on the end of a guy's hand, if you want to make a guy 20 feet tall with a 20-foot top hat, that there's no boundaries. And I think I really loved that. And that was a big influence on me as well. I'm a huge fan of it. I loved the comic, the Gold Key comic. And I still have it. It's missing the cover and a couple of pages and the insert poster, but I still have it somewhere buried.
That's another parallel. You and me both, mate. I've got mine as well.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
That's great.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, for sure.
So all these things kind of contributed as a kid, and again, getting to the comics, I really kind of would love any comic I could get my hand on. I would learn to love it one way or the other. And it was so funny because, like I said, my uncles had all the Marvels, but over on my mom's side of the family, at my grandparents' house there was a stack of comics that were kind of the communal stack for my visiting cousins, and they would leave it there. and there were no Marvels in that stack.
Yeah.
It was all Gold Key, Dell, and Archie comics. And there was a Classics Illustrated in there, which was the Moonstone. And that was my first, and I reread that a gazillion times. And that was probably the first time I read anything that was like an adaptation,
Yeah.
But I loved the Archie comics. I love the Gold Key. I mean, I just all the different stories. They did not. So I didn't have a specific love for superhero stuff. I mean, it was great, but I always liked how DC stories were kind of self-contained.
Yes.
And the Marvels, my uncles didn't necessarily buy every single issue, so I would never know how things. They were always continued. I wouldn't find out till it's like, oh, I can finally figure out, how the story ends. But there was no doubt about it. In that time period of ours, Marvel was like very cool. And DC stuff was more restrained.
It was indeed. But something you said that really rings a bell with me is something I used to say until I was probably into my mid to late 20s after I finished college was that, well, I've never read a comic book that I didn't love. And I would just read anything. I would read everything that came in my path, irrespective of company. It didn't matter to me exactly like what you were saying. Didn't have to be DC or Marvel. It could be Classics Illustrated. I used to love all the Gold Key Lone Rangers, the ones with the photo covers of Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels. And I used to love the Charlton books. I used to I remember I was on holiday a couple of times when I was a teenager and I picked up some of the Charlton Phantoms, which are actually quite macabre. And there's a whole run of them with like airbrushed covers that are illustrated by Don Newton and illustrated by Jim Aparo.
Yeah, those are wonderful.
And they just lived on in my mind. I mean, you're talking about really minor comics in a sense, but they did stuff with the Phantom. They often took him out of the jungle setting. And these books, they did just feel quite ominous in their tone. And I remember the whole experiment that they did with, oh man, the name of the lines just popped out, the Atlas line. In the early mid 70s, when Goodman tried to do some else, and he came up with all those books like Target and the Phoenix and the Scorpion and all that kind of stuff for a period of time. Everything, if it was a comic book, I would consume it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny about the Atlas. So when I was younger, and I would read those, that period in the 60s. That was one phase, and then that period where when the Atlas books came out.
Yeah,
that was when I was in my early teens, and I distinctly remember that's when I first started learning about. That was a completely different era, because then you got into the stuff that was to me more like, then it was like serious, and it was like, and I think specifically all of a sudden, DC had like Neil Adams, doing the Green Lantern and Green Arrow stuff that had all this written by Denny O'Neil that had all the social issues in it. But also for me, what was really huge was discovering Howard Chaykin and Walter Simonson's work, because that's when I first found. I remember it was the chapter. It was called Cathedral Perilous. That was one of the. It was in the back of a bat. I was in the back of a Batman.
It's Detective Comics. It was in the back of
100-page issue.
100-page issues. Yeah.
And I get to the back of the book, and it's like, this thing was only like 7 or 8 pages, and it just blew my mind. It was like one of the most incredible things I'd seen, and it was a whole different thing. I couldn't believe how much story Walter and Archie Goodwin, the writer, had put into such a small segment.
Yeah.
And then with Howard, it was with those Atlas books. I picked them all. There was a spinner rack at a little drugstore. And I went in, I don't know how they managed the distribution, because I know they had some difficulties with it. I didn't know that at the time, but they had all the Atlas books. So I just picked up every single number one. And it was kind of like, it was like, they were interesting, right?
Yeah, right.
And I loved, there was one called The Destructor, which was...
Oh, man, that Destructor... Archie Goodwin, Steve Ditko, and brilliantly Wally Wood on the inks. And Ditko and Wood is an amazing combination that you would never think would work, right? But it works beautifully.
Yeah, so that was great fun. But the Scorpion,
to
me was like, this is like a whole new thing. This is like something different. It was just like that Manhunter. And what it was specifically to me was that both Walter and Howard were integrating. They were integrating all these things I'm talking about with the angular work, the graphics, the sound effects, and they really, I thought it just was something where I'm like, this is something I can relate to. As a younger person, I was like, something that really clicked with me. Steranko's work had that vibe to me when I was a little bit younger as well. And I remember as a kid too, further back, I mean, I loved Kirby and Ditko very much, but the one that I was always kind of like, had a sense of reality to me, and I couldn't understand how he did it, was Gene Colan.
Oh, yeah,
Gene
sure.
Colan's work also had, it was how Gene Colan was a regular comic artist is still, it's so unlike anything else.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really individual artists, but nobody has that Colan look and feel. And that supremely kinetic art that he has, everything feels like it's in motion all the time. You can really feel things moving on the page.
Yes. Yeah. So all these different things were, again, I looking back, I find it interesting how, I'll see what other people are influenced by in comics and certain mediums. And these were the things, looking back, these are the things that really kind of, leapt out at me, so these were like key moments and all that sort of thing. But as far as, again, from childhood on, that mid-60s period was really quite something, and it was quite an interesting period. And it was a neat period to be a kid in terms of, I think that there was a lot of stuff coming out all at once, and then it kind of dissipated, by the early 70s, that initial push. So.
That's very true. That was that huge pop culture boom that you've just referenced, and it was so very rich. From essentially, if it's from Batman '66 onwards, I think the pedal really got stamped down. But it exists on a number of levels. It's not just the superhero camp of Batman. It's what you've touched upon. It's those great spy shows because it's you've got Man from U.N.C.L.E., you've got I Spy. You've got the British spy shows, which you just referenced. Then you've got the early years of Mission Impossible, which is quite different to the latter years of the show. It's such a rich period of time. I mean, you and I, as we talked about before, have exactly the same pop culture references, identically the same. And to jump forward, John, when I first became aware of your work, it was when Fashion in Action appeared in Timothy Truman's Scout, which I reckon is the mid-'80s, if I remember correctly. So how did Fashion in Action come about?
Well, getting back to, my career and its beginnings and such, what happened was as I was working at a graphic studio. And again, it was a different era. You really couldn't, I really wasn't quite sure what I was going to be doing. I knew I loved comics and movies and television and all these different things. But I mean, the idea of actually breaking into any of this stuff there really wasn't any kind of a roadmap to it, and it was just a very different era in terms of, how are you going to make that connection? And I would read articles and books about sending in submissions and all that sort of thing. And so I just kind of winged it. And I got to a point in my life where I just decided that I was going to do one story, where I was going to write, draw, ink, letter, one comic story. And I just turned 20, and I went to college for a little bit, got out, moved out on my own. And I was like, I got to do this. Right. So I was I was very fortunate. A friend of mine had got me a job at a graphic studio. This was in the DC area. And we were literally, because of the lack of technology at the time, we were doing all this business work where we were hand inking bar charts and graphs and, cut and paste and all these things that are completely primitive, by today's standards. It's hard to describe. But what was really great about all that was we would get, a certain amount of charts would have to be done in a very fast turnaround time. We had a job board in the hallway at the office, and it would just be full of all the pink receipts with the due dates. I mean, just dozens of them. And you know, my buddy and I, we were the younger guys, so you know, we'd get the late night shifts, and you know, we'd work on Saturdays, that sort of thing, and have to get the stuff out. So it was like, even though it wasn't any kind of illustration work or anything, you know, glamorous in no respect, it was learning how to turn around volume in a very short period of time. So it gave me a sense of completion. I think looking back on it, I didn't realize it, but it gave me a sense of completion, that it was possible to get something done, you know? And I think for when I talk to a lot of younger people, it's like, what I try to emphasize to them is, even if it's only 5 pages or 10 pages, if you're doing a story, you know, to start testing your abilities,
yes,
make sure to get all the way to the end. And that's really tough for a lot of younger people. And I understand that, you know, because it's kind of hard to see things through all the way through, but it's doable. You know, one way or the other, you can actually get there. And I kind of got shown that with my work. So I would come home at night, and we're talking about eras. At this point, I'm fully indoctrinated into all the new music that was coming out at that time. You know, not so much punk, but I was loving. I was living in the DC area. There was a place called the 930 Club down on F Street in downtown DC. It was a small place that only held about 200 people. But they were getting people from all over the world coming through. And I think one of the first bands I saw there was the Revillos.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Scottish band, you know, like, and what an amazing thing. It's like, here's a band from Scotland, you know, it's like, wow, what a wonderful, and they were so visually, it was amazing.
Yeah.
The guy had the shoulder pads with the lights.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, it was so, I was, you know, again, it was a major influence for me and really very motivating. We had a wonderful alternative radio station, WHFS, in the area. So I was getting to listen to a lot of this music. So this was kind of fueling my idea generation to do this one story, and it was called Brick Starbuster Space Mercenary, and it was a tongue-in-cheek kind of punk rock, drawn like in what I thought was a Chester Gould type style.
Yeah.
You know, kind of, you know, dystopian thing of a guy that's got no morals, you know, and you know, it's a lot of heavy black areas and all that. Anyway, I drew this whole thing, and it took me, I did it over, you know, the first year I was out of the house, and made 10 photocopies of it. And I just following all these little articles I'd read and such, you know, I'd go to the drugstore and look all the addresses or whatever I had at home. And I got the address for Heavy Metal and Epic Illustrated, which was Marvel's kind of semi.
That was a great book. Yeah. Yeah. It was a great magazine. Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. And there was, and also the small alternative world, of comics had just started. So you had Pacific Comics had just started up, which ended up putting out the Rocketeer. So I got about, and the guys up at DC, I found DC and Marvel's General. Anyway, I remember I got 10 photocopies, 10 cover letters, 10 envelopes, and I just mailed them all out at the same time. And I knew at the time that they were probably all going to get rejected. I was pretty realistic about it, you know, at the time. So I did, and I actually kept those rejection letters. One of them was from Archie, who ended up working with me on Doctor Mid-Nite over at Epic. Yeah. And they were all, for the most part, form letters. And so, you know, I kind of put it aside. And I was still working at the graphic place, and I was starting to do artwork for local bands. I was trying to do something, you know. So that was one venue, and there was a local club down the street. I had moved to Alexandria, Virginia at this point. And there was this little rundown place called the 704 Club, and I was doing monthly calendars for them, just getting giant poster board and like putting in like collages and drawings and stuff and stick. In that time period, I got a letter finally from Eclipse Comics from Dean Mullaney.
Yeah.
And he explained to me, and it was the first person where it wasn't a form letter. So he explained to me that he thought the artwork was promising. I could work on the writing, but the character was too much of a anti-hero creep, and no one's going to like, you know, a guy that's just bad, you know. Yeah. And it's kind of funny in retrospect, because it was just like, as you know, and because now so many shows are centered around, you know, real anti-hero types. But in any respect, you know, that was really great to me. I took that as a huge positive. And I was still drawing all the time. I was drawing in my sketchbooks. I was still trying to do as much artwork as I could. I was trying to get involved a little bit in the local DC art scene, but very peripherally. Because again, I was never really part of any particular group.
Yeah.
I was always kind of just wandering about. But anyway, I had actually went to a small show, and I met Tim Truman. And Tim was there with John Ostrander and I believe Mike Gold. And they had just started up First Comics. And I'd still had copies of this Brick Starbuster thing. And I showed it to Tim. And Tim got very, very enthusiastic about it. And he was like, it appealed to Tim. Tim, as I later learned, was into a lot of comic art overseas and was, Tim's got this really wonderful eye for, and introduced me to a lot of terrific artists around the world. Yeah. So he saw something in my work that a lot of other people did not pick up on. And that was a break for me. So we ended up communicating via postcards and letters. And about a year later, he was working on a graphic novel for First Comics called Time Beavers. And it was like a funny animal space opera, which was kind of a thing at the time. You had Bucky O'Hare, and I think Rocket Raccoon had just started, had made his first appearance. But this was Tim's own thing, and he wanted to get it out. So he offered for me to come up and stay with him and his wife and young son up in Wisconsin for about a month. And we were in a little room, and he had a drawing table on one side and a drawing table on the other. And we literally sat back to back, and I would work on these really rough layouts. And then he would on the light table draw these really detailed pencils, over the top and tighten up everything. And again, it was that production thing. I mean, we got in there, and it was we turned around. I think we walked into Mike Gold's office there at First Comics with, this 48-page stack of pencils, like within 6 weeks, you know?
Wow.
And so, it was, but I was into it, and it was exciting. It was really an exciting time because, you turn on the TV. I remember right before I got ready to leave, we were looking at the TV, and it was like a commercial for the Terminator, the first Terminator.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be any good,
It was a glorious time, though, because I really loved the early years of Eclipse, and I really loved the early years of First. I really loved First's output and Pacific Comics, all that stuff. It was a great time to be a comics lover because I felt there was so much glorious experimentation, but so much great stuff was coming out, which it was coming from the DC and Marvel factory. It was coming from elsewhere with a different sensibility, but it's a sensibility that's really informed a lot of what has happened in the comics medium in the 30, 40 years since.
Oh, I really do agree. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's when I felt like I had a chance because I didn't really feel like, I was not a superhero artist, and it's something that I didn't really try to do. And so, the idea of doing something for Marvel or DC, it didn't even really ever cross my mind. It was always like, maybe I can do something for Epic Illustrated. Maybe I could do something for Heavy Metal. But then when you saw what First was doing and Eclipse, then that opened things up. So while I was with Tim working on Time Beavers, he said, I've got an idea for this new book called Scout. I'm going to do it over at Eclipse, and I'm going to need a backup feature.
Yeah.
And I had brought my sketchbooks with me, and he's like, I like this. And I had actually started drawing the fashion and action characters as a thought, from coming home from the clubs and seeing all the different fashions and my love of the old spy stuff, it all kind of blended together. Yeah. And I would be adverse not to mention that a huge part of the influence visually of this sort of thing was, again, as a kid, I absolutely loved the stuff that was coming out like the Avengers, the actual, Emma, the actual
Peel. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. And
mate, if you will see, there's my bowler hat and there's my umbrella, artfully placed in the room. So I know exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah. So that whole era, and again, as a kid, it's not like now where you can go on Google search and see a million images. They would appear like blips on the radar for me. An episode of the Avengers it was never on regularly. It would pop on, and I would be like, what was that? And it was almost, and The Prisoner, huge, because when I was a kid, my dad and I would watch the Jackie Gleason show. This was back in '68, and it was the summer replacement for Jackie Gleason. And so it was
what
like
a replacement that must have
right.
been.
So, one week we're watching, it's Jackie Gleason with doing his routines. And the next week it's this guy in all black running from a giant white balloon, and it was like, wow. I mean, you can't, the imagery was so powerful that even as a kid, even though it was totally over my head, it was, fantastic, So there was, and I remember one time it was like Sunday night at the movies on ABC or whatever. They had a showing of this movie with Diana Rigg called The Assassination Bureau.
Oh, The Assassination Bureau. Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic.
And that, again, it's this kind of, before they called it steampunk, you had this kind of technology.
Absolutely.
And Oliver Reed, I think, was the bad guy. And
anti-hero, but is he good? Is he bad? Kind of.
Right.
And they have such great chemistry, the two of them.
I'd love to see the movie again. I haven't seen it. I can't remember since when. So.
Yeah, you know what? I don't think I've seen it more than once, and I think both of the times I saw it, I was under the age of 12. So it's very, very similar. And by the way, mate, something I wanted to say is that I think something you and I have in common, and we've talked about The Prisoner on our own time because I'm a big lover of that show. And in fact, I love all those ITC adventure shows that they're produced by Lou Grade over here in the UK, shot at like the big name studios, Pinewood, Elstree, whatever, but they were shot like American shows on big budgets on 35mm film, which most British TV drama of the time was shot on videotape, right? But these were shot with movie style budgets and for sale to the American market, which is why very often the leads in those shows, not in The Prisoner, not The Avengers, but in all the other shows, most of the leads are American, right? And I love all of those shows. So you haven't just got The Prisoner and, The Avengers was ATV, but you've got The Saint and you've got Man in a Suitcase and The Baron and The Champions and Randall and Hopkirk Deceased. And I don't know how many of those shows you've actually seen yourself.
They would pop up again. They would pop up. It would every once in a while. It'd turn up. There was one with Robert Vaughn. What was that?
Oh, that's The Protectors.
The Protectors,
which has an amazing theme tune, by the way.
Yes, it came on, and it was like, "Oh, cool! What's this?" And then it was like it was never on again. These things on randomly, and I was like, and again, we didn't have it was like a one-time deal. You would see these things, and so I don't know. I think sometimes that made it resonate even more. So a lot of that stuff kind of it got into so Tim's like develop fashion and action. And so it's all these things we've been talking about. I just kind of poured all of that into this, And again, I was absolutely in love with, at that time, I was starting to learn more about comics from around the world. And Eclipse had just published Strange Days.
Yeah.
And that was my introduction to Peter Milligan and Andrew McCarthy and all those guys. Yeah. And just the first issue of that was, I know people talk, Watchmen's great and Dark Knight and all that, and milestone books in their lives.
Yeah,
I was mentioning Scorpion, but Strange Days visually was just like, it was stretching the limits of what could be done. And what I was seeing was some of the stuff that was being done in heavy metal and like the more, slick, super slick. It was like, it was starting to integrate itself into the stuff that was at the comic shop. So I was like, I felt like the world was opening up to be able to do these sort of things. Also, my introduction to Judge Dredd. I just absolutely loved everybody that was working on Judge Dredd. All those, Mike McMahon and Cam Kennedy, and all those guys were just. So all this stuff was a big influence on me. So really, and of course I'd seen Blade Runner and that, was a huge impact too. So all that kind of filtered into fashion and action. And again, getting back to Manhunter, Tim told me that, I was going to have a 7 to 8 issue slot to do fashion and action.
Yeah.
And it was going to be 8 pages. So my idea was, well, I'm not going to do eight little stories. I'm going to do one long extended story, just like they did in Manhunter. So, and that worked out really well. So anyway, that's a little bit of the background of how all that came together.
Now that is fascinating, and I am a huge fan of Manhunter. It's one of my all-time favorite comics, and I was lucky enough to read it in real time. Get it as reading Detective Comics every month, and I've read it in numerous collected editions ever since. But I think what's great about that piece of work is I don't think that Walt's art has dated in any way as an experience. Yeah, the sensibility is rooted in the 70s, but as a piece of entertainment, it's still fresh and exciting now when you read it. It's put together so beautifully. It's way ahead of its time, I think.
I really love his work too, and still do. And I thought it was interesting. He had mentioned that an influence on him was the artist for the comic strip Modesty Blaze, which again was a huge influence on me. And I had only seen a couple of that. I'm sorry, the artist's name on that was
that's an excellent question.
But his work again, I'd only seen a couple of strips in it, and it was reprinted in the Penguin Book of Comics. And so that, even just being able to look at those, I loved that style that he had.
Yeah, he was wonderful, wasn't he? He was wonderful. I mean, it was such a fascinating strip. Was it? Well, oh yeah, because the author who created Modesty Blaze was Peter O'Donnell, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jim Holdaway was that author.
Thank you, Holdaway. Yeah. I was going to say Holiday. I knew it was the right. Yeah. Right.
It's beautiful work. Yeah, right. It's really beautiful. So John, actually, the other thing I want to say about this era is I feel that when it comes to The Prisoner, I think that you were sartorially influenced by that show in the same way that I was. Because whenever I see you, like myself, you have a very fondness for a sort of black colour palette with your clothing.
Yeah,
you're like me. You're a man who wears black. A man of a certain age who wears black on black all the time.
Yeah, I can't help it. I mean, it's definitely
me neither.
A major impact. I'm always looking over my shoulder for the Rover.
For the Rovers, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, so true. So true. Have you ever been to Port Merion, mate?
No, I have not, but it was funny. I had just seen that. I just saw that somebody there. I guess they have like a live cam. Yeah. Just projecting out there on a regular. I got a big laugh out of that there's there. Have you been there?
Yeah, I've been there a lot, and because obviously I'm here in the UK, so I'm able to. The first time I went was before I ever saw the show, but my mum had seen the show, and I was captivated by the place when I first. I was probably 10, and for some reason I hadn't. Maybe my mum and dad at the time thought that the Prisoner itself was too adult, and I only came to out of all those. I saw all of those ITC shows, but I didn't see The Prisoner until I was actually in college. But so I went around Port Merion and was captivated by it before I ever saw the TV show. But funnily enough, one of the many times since that I've been there is when I got married to the lovely mother of my children, to whom I'm no longer married, but she's one of my best friends. She's a great person. But we got married at Port Merion.
Oh,
and it was just a fantastic moment in time, and it was such a fantastic weekend. And I'd heartily recommend it to anybody who's looking for a wedding venue, that get married at Port Merion. It's an incredible place.
Oh, that's neat. That is really neat. It looks quite. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant choice to use.
Inspired. Yeah. You would love it, mate. But to flip back to you, so you got Fashion in Action under your belt, and then you worked with the other thing. Then when I was next really aware of your work is that great arc you did with Matt Wagner and Grendel, The God and the Devil. How did that come about?
Well, I had worked on Fashion in Action. I actually followed up the one long installment with a couple of extra specials, and then worked on some other work with Eclipse, and then moved on to. At the time, I had actually, again, getting back to my influences, Kamiko had picked up Johnny Quest, the license for Johnny Quest, and I was like, again, with the kind of work I was doing in Fashion in Action, I thought that would translate pretty well into Johnny Quest. So I had sent a couple of pages to try out. And the editor on the book, Diana Schutz, had said she was like, we've already got some people lined up. Would you do a gallery piece? So I did a gallery piece with the characters. And then I believe when she returned the art, there was a little sticky note on there saying, would you be interested in working with Matt Wagner on Grendel? And I knew of Matt's work at the time. I knew about Grendel. I knew about Mage, but I had actually I was not that familiar with the books. So, and so, I went to the store and I picked up a copy of Grendel, which is at that time was the run with Christine Spar.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I get it, because I did fashion and action, and you've got a strong female lead, and I get it. They want me to do a Christine Spar. It makes sense to me. And I'm like, yeah, this is really cool. It has a very lot of similar sensibilities with the fashion and all that sort of thing. And I think maybe I'd had a brief phone call with Matt, and I'll never forget it. It was so funny because I was like, so you want me to, I was like, yeah, this looks really cool. And I'm really interested in it. And I said, so I'll be drawing Christine Spar. Right. And he's like, no, we're going to kill her off. I got something all different planned for you. And immediately was like, I think I'm going to like working with this guy, because that was just absolutely like, you're going to what? This is a great character. What's happening?
Yeah.
But I loved that there was going to be that kind of unpredictability. It away was like, okay, this is not going to be like anything. This is not going to be run of the mill anything, right? So I was definitely on board. And so then from there, I had some communication with Diana, and then we started figuring out how the book was going to be mapped out. And Diana, I was inking my own stuff at the time, but with the workload and such, 26 pages an issue on a monthly schedule, it was going to be like, we was going to need an inker. And I loved the way Jay was inking the Panda Brothers at the time. So, I was like, well, can Jay come on board? So I remember Jay and Matt and I met at San Diego. I think it was a 1987 show. And we took a break from the show and walked to a separate, I think we walked down to like a little restaurant or something. And Matt laid out the initial, like, here's my basic idea. I want it set in the future. Here's the basic setting. And he had come up with the idea of splitting up the different art chores, where I would draw the majority of the storyline, and then I would pencil the majority of the 10-issue storyline. Jay would do the 3-issue in between spots between each issue that would spotlight the main Grendel character, and then the other 7 issues would deal with this whole universe that this world that the characters were in. And we both went home, and, I just off of this one little meeting started doing a bunch of little drawings, just like basic ideas about what to do with the characters and that sort of thing. And Jay did some too. And it just started to all come together from there.
Yeah.
And we were off and running by fall. So.
And that book really exploded and got you a major amount of attention, was my perception at the time. I think it certainly seemed to be an accelerant for your career, I think.
I think so too. And it was funny because, from my point of view, I was always busy. I mean, it was a really busy period. I was always working, and it was like, I think it was one of those things where things would just happen, and it would be a timing thing. Something new would come up, and then it would be like, okay, I'll work on this. And then, okay, I'll work on this. And I did not realize, I knew Grendel had some popularity, but I did not realize until I started working on the series just how popular it was, and then it became very apparent once I got involved in it that, I was involved in something that had already had a very big following. So, so it was neat, it was definitely a neat experience. And I was so happy that at this point, I think people are getting conditioned to the fact that Grendel, whoever was Grendel, was only going to be Grendel a temporary period, because I think they'd already killed off Hunter Rose and killed off Christine Spar. And there's a character, I think, after that Bernie Moreau had done a few issues of. So at that point, people were, I think, used to the fact that, this was going to be temporary, whatever version. Yeah. But it's nice. I like the fact that to this day, so many people are so enamored of specifically the Epi Thatcher version.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, it introduced a very fruitful creative relationship between you and Matt Wagner. Of course,
We had a lot of fun, yeah.
And I've had a lot of fun reading your work. I mean, relatively recently, I really enjoyed what you did with Lady Zorro at Dynamite. But the thing that I'd like to get into a bit more detail on is, I think my personal favourite of your collaborations is the Peter Cross Doctor Mid-Nite. I think I really love that series. I bought it. I've still got my 3 Prestige issues, and I've got my collected edition as well. But I really love the execution of that book. And it was one of the things I was talking to Matt about the other week. But when you look back on that, I'm thinking you must have a lot of fondness for it.
I do. And, I think one of the things was that you were, Matt and I are born just a few months apart. We have very similar, there's a lot of things that he and I can talk, it's finish, pick up a sentence and he'll finish it and that sort of thing. So I think we had a lot of creative sensibilities that were so similar that I thought we worked together very, very well, and he would come up with a basic idea, and then I would run with it, and then he would go back and he would do his dialogue. And I thought that his writing on our run of Grendel was really fantastic. I mean, I would get the stuff back, and I just loved the way he wrote. I especially loved the way he wrote the last issue of our run. I thought it was just the last page is one of my. I still have the original of that. It's and one of the reasons I love having it so much is I love his writing on that page. I think it's so good. And I just thought that we really blended well together. So as we were winding down that run, I was like, I want to keep working with this guy, And I had talked to him. I said, and he had started doing stuff over at DC, and I had through the conventions had finally managed to talk to Archie Goodwin, And Archie was moving over to DC, and I was like, hey guys, can we do something? And at this time, again, the comics business was going through some changes where with the popularity of Dark Knight and Watchmen and some of the stuff that was going on, that DC and Marvel were opening up to doing painted stuff. I want to say also that what was a big breakthrough book that a lot of people I don't think realize was that Dave McKean did a Black Orchid.
The Neil Gaiman, Dave McKean, Black Orchid. Beautifully illustrated.
Yeah. And I remember when that came in, and it was, again, I don't think a lot of people remember that because they remember Arkham Asylum, but Black Orchid preceded it. And there was nothing like that before. No. There was one page in particular where it was like Lex Luthor. It's a full page of him at a table. And it was done in black and white. It was a main image of him, but then the left-hand side of it was split up in sequential panels, and it had a little bit of color in it, right? So the point is that there had never been a mainstream comic with a mainstream character like Lex Luthor rendered in this kind of really artistic, illustrative fashion. Yeah. And coming out from a company like DC Comics, right? Yeah. So that was a really big deal. And I think that really opened up to me. It's a
great depiction of Batman in that book as well.
Yeah.
The Batman scenes are incredible.
So it really opened up it was like, wow, there's potential here. And I also had done the before graphic novels, they called them prestige format books, which were, the kind of stiff covers with the perfect binding. And I had done the adaptations of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
On The Secret Agent, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was great. That was Secret Agent. I thought Jekyll and Hyde was great, but I did a thesis on Secret Agent for my English degree. So
really?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, 100%.
Send it along sometime.
The indolent Monsieur Verloc. It's for sure. But I really responded to your adaptation. I thought it was lovely.
Oh, thank you. So I'd had a precedent to be able to do something full color. And so anyway, I had been able to talk to Archie and Matt. Matt was on board for it. And we went through a process of elimination because even back then, it was difficult to get a character approved, to be able to. And so the whole thing is I kind of reached into characters that, I knew it would be difficult to try to do something with, somebody like Batman or Superman or something like that. But I thought, well, if we get a character that's not being used like a lot, like the same way they did Black Orchid, and Doctor Mid-Nite, going back to wearing all black. Dr. Mid-Nite had been a personal favorite of mine since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Specifically because of an Alex Toss segment in Justice Society that had been reprinted in one of those 100-page books. So we managed to get the okay from Archie. Archie managed to get the okay for us to do something with Doctor Mid-Nite, and then it was the same thing where Matt would have a germ of an idea, and I would just start drawing all these different ideas, and then Matt would okay, let's fine tune this, and again, we were on the same page because Matt and I both just love pulps, the old 30s pulp thing, Shadow, all that sort of thing. And it's real funny because he grew up reading Shadow reprints, the paperback reprints but I was really into Doc Savage. I thought Savage.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And the Shadow books were hard. I couldn't find them when I was a kid, but Doc Savage was everywhere. So,
yeah, right.
So it kind of blended, again, Doc Savage, Doctor Mid-Nite. So it's kind of blending these various elements together. And it was really an exciting time because there was nobody at that time. There was no holds barred. We could do whatever we wanted in terms of, the character development. We came up with a whole bunch of new, he would be in this inner city kind of on the streets doctor helping out people on the streets. And he, like Doc Savage and Shadow would have operatives. He would have operatives, and they would be like people of the street. And the whole thing just had, it just to me, it was just a big playground,
Yeah.
And it just had limitless possibilities. And it was so great to be able to, to work in all these different color mediums as opposed to the straight pencil ink process color. So it was really an exciting time. And I had suggested at the time that we use the Terrible Trio because, again, they were these obscure Batman villains that I had remembered as a kid. And again, getting back to even the Littlest Plague Doctor thing and the Wind in the Willows, I always loved the little creatures walking around in clothes.
Yeah, absolutely. These
little gangsters with the shark head and the fox and all that. And it was very easy to turn them from being just, regular crooks to like these big corporate, creatures, So it all seemed, and it all kind of tied in because Dr. Mid-Nite, has the owl, and you have this kind of connection between the environment and animals and science and the pulps, and it was just great fun, Yeah,
and really enjoyed it. I can see that, and I think your playground analogy is very well made. And I too, as you know, I'm a huge pulp fan, so all of that resonated with me. And at a similar time, you did that very memorable art, the Janus Directive, right, with John Ostrander on Suicide Squad, which to this day that is extremely well considered. Very well remembered for that run. And I would say that Suicide Squad therefore is a property that you're always associated with, and that must be truly a pleasure at this moment in time, because I know you've done bits and pieces around the Suicide Squad movie, the James Gunn flick. That must be so great to be in the middle of that while it's going down.
It's really a pleasant surprise. And preceding Dr. Mid-Nite, I had gotten a call from John Ostrander, and he asked if I'd be interested in working on Suicide Squad. And he and his wife at the time, Kim Yale, were writing the book. And Kim was a huge fan of fashion. Kim and John also were big fans of fashion and action. And as I told you, I really was not, I didn't consider myself a superhero artist, but at the same time, John and Kim's writing and the nature of the book with these kind of like third-rate villains that were kind of doomed, being part of the Suicide Squad, with these missions, these impossible missions, it all made sense, right?
Yeah,
and I felt a certain amount of freedom because it was kind of like anything goes, no one's going to be particularly concerned about how things work out for Captain Boomerang, or
correct,
or at the time Peacemaker, or these various characters. So it was a lot of fun, and John and Kim's scripts were, they were so good. They would send me these full scripts and it was so much fun because, it had a strong sense of superhero, the superhero adventure, but it was very satirical, but it was still respectful of the characters. And and John is John's a really great writer, and John's been involved with stage and comedy and all that kind of thing. He's really got a lot of depth, and him and Kim both brought this. It was just a great amount of fun to work on.
Yeah.
And so when they called me and said, we want you to work on this, the first thing I had to do out the gate was this Janus Directive tie-in. So it was tied in with all these different books, and it was going to be like all these different characters that I'd never heard of. And DC Comics sent me a pile of Who's Who, which was like a directory comic. And I'll never forget, I got this pile FedEx because they couldn't email you, like JPEGs or anything at the time. So I got this pile with all these different characters from all the different books. And I went and made photocopies of it was like 30 different characters. And I got a big roll of brown mailing paper. And in my studio, I just put the brown paper up on the wall and started taping up all these different copies of all these different characters and just drawing lines to which book, which characters were part of, because it was the only way to figure it all out, And it was so funny because it had to get done in a very short period of time. So it was really intense, but I was very lucky because those 4 issues for a guy just starting out on something like that, I was very lucky because my editor at the time, Bob Greenberger, assigned Pablo Morcos and Carl Kiesel to do the finishes over my work. And Carl did a beautiful job. And Pablo, I was a huge fan of since I was a kid from Tales of the Zombie, which was a Marvel horror comic he did. And the whole thing came together, and it was really neat. It was really a neat process. And then John called me up after that, and he's like, "Hey, John, do you want to go to Apocalypse? Because we're going to have all the characters, and we're going to have Darkseid and Female Furies." And it was a playground, it was like getting in the sandbox with the toys, and it was all so much fun. And I loved working on all of it. And it was so funny. It's so funny to me to see, if you had told me, this is 33 years ago that I did those first issues. If you had told me that there was not only one, but 2 Suicide Squad movies, and that everybody was really excited about Peacemaker, who at the time was a joke. Had moved over from Charlton. You were talking about the Charlton books. It's unfathomable. I can't even but it's great, And I think the thing that excites me the most about this new one is when I heard they were doing the sequel, it was like, oh, that's cool. But when I heard they had James Gunn working on it, because I had seen Super recently for the first time.
What a great film! What a great film, mate!
It's like the guy,
brilliant sensibility.
Yeah. So I just thought the guy that's doing Super is doing Suicide Squad. I'm like, that is a match made in heaven.
1,000%. And not only that, but the guy is actually, undoubtedly and very vocally a massive fan of John's work and a massive fan of your respective run on the book. So, he frequently name checks, yours and John's work on Suicide Squad and Kim's work on Suicide Squad. And I've got to tell you, mate, I was a huge fan of the book. And actually my personal Suicide Squad story is that years ago, one of the first journalism gigs I had, this is way before I ever worked for the Enemy and all those titles, was I used to contribute to Speakeasy, which is a British magazine about comic books, published by John Brown, who also published the great comedy. And very, very early on in my involvement, I was asked to do a top 10 comics of the moment thing. And I did. My top 10 comics I used all of the page length to talk about one comic book, which was yours and John's run on Suicide Squad, which at the time I described as absolutely perfect like B-movie comics, to me. And I thought you guys and Kim were just doing something else that nobody was doing in comics in that time. And the fact that you were just lurching through the DC back catalogue, but giving it this very pulpy sensibility, this real sense of pace and humour, I really thought it was an exceptional book. And so I instead of doing this top 10, I just wrote it all up, this rave about Suicide Squad. And as a result of that, I got hired by that magazine and I got a full-time job out of it. Yeah. So
glad to hear it.
so my entire career as a journalist, basically, you can almost time back to that rave review of your run on Suicide Squad, and edited, as you just mentioned, by our mutual friend Bob Greenberger. So Bob, if you're listening to this, thanks to you as well, mate. So yeah, I mean, it's wonderful hearing you talk about that time, because I could see just by reading and absorbing the book to the degree that I did, that you must have been loving creating that. And Ostrander and Kim must have been loving writing it. And it just looked like there was so much creative alchemy in it.
I saw that James Gunn had posted a photo of him and John Ostrander on the set for Suicide Squad. And that he had John in as a role. I guess he's the doctor that injects them with the explosive device so they can't get away. And I think that's been pretty much my favorite moment of watching the production of this movie so far. I mean, it's just so great to see John getting the acknowledgement he deserves. And I just think that it's wonderful that he's in the movie, but not only in the movie, but there's this acknowledgement of his work on the movie. I mean, work on the series. Because it's just really a nice thing to see, and it's just really a pleasant kind of a synchronicity, between the comics and movies, to have that kind of respect for and acknowledgement of the original source. Even though the creative people making the movies are going in their own direction and making their thing, but it's great to acknowledge that original source too. I'm very excited for the movie. I think it's going to be great. And it was really a pleasure I did a couple of variant covers I think it was for Infinite Frontier. They did a series of covers that are coming out in August, the month the movie comes out. So it was really a thrill to go back and revisit these characters after all these years. And it was really nice to be brought back on board to do that. So it really is it is a lot of fun.
Oh, I know. I was very pleased to see you back on it, and I'm very impressed just from what I've seen from the trailers alone about how much of yours and John's DNA is in the project. I think I'm very excited about. I don't really get excited about. I mean, I love superhero movies, but there are so many of them. Even to a massive fan like me, it's almost impossible to get excited about them before they come out. Some of them are great experiences, but I'll go and see them and have a good time. But this one, for all of that, having that history of being such a fan of your work on the book on that period of time, and to see so much of it reflected in the bits and pieces I've seen, I can only imagine what it's like for you guys, waiting to see that film. If I was you, I'd be like, man, roll it now. I want to see it.
Oh, I'm pretty excited about it. It's funny. I took one of my daughters with me to see the first movie.
Yeah,
and we had a lot of fun watching it, but it was really fun because we were watching it, and when they got to the end, when they had their big fight, it has on the front, it has written the Ostrander building. Yeah, and I looked over to my daughter and I said, "That's my friend who wrote the book. Who used to write the comic. It was like it's really kind of fun to have that. So I'm hoping to grab hopefully both of my daughters to come with me to see the movie when it comes out in August.
Oh yeah, mate, you've got to do that. That'll be a wonderful family moment.
Yeah. Right. So,
and John, where I'd like to sort of wind up our conversation for today, because there's other things that we could talk about of yours that I loved. I really loved your Mr. E book. I thought that was great, and I love the work you did on Phoenix Without Ashes, which was Harlan Ellison's, when he originally published that as a book, because it was originally his Starlost pilot, wasn't it? Right.
Yes.
I bought and read that in the time and loved it. I also love what you did on that. But of course, what I want to talk to you about is, like, one of the other many things we have in common is that we're huge fans of the great Lawrence Block and his PI character Matt Scudder. And as you know, one of the things I do on the side is edit noir fiction, and I work on the Mike Hammer books with Max Allen Collins. When I say work on them, I'm his editor. He writes them and he does a spectacularly good job. But I'm a huge Lawrence Block fan, as are you. And I would love to hear about your particular ride with your fantastic adaptation of 8 Million Ways to Die, and how that came about and how long it took you to do and where it came from.
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think of a good starting point. Well, because it's such a big story.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of, I'm like, how I got from here to there on it. But I've always been a big fan of, I guess you would call it film noir before these things really started getting classified that way. Right? And I loved mystery stuff. I mean, as a kid, going back to when I was a kid, I think the first thing that I really, one of my first loves was the original Dick Tracy comic strip, and I had a collection of the original 1930s and 40s stories. I think Bonanza Books had put it out, of the early Chester Gould stuff, which was unbelievably intense and violent,
Yeah,
and that really appealed to me as a kid. When I was a kid, there was like this nostalgia for like old gangster movies and Cagney and Bogart, and you had the Dick Tracy and the Sting had come out. There was all this kind of. But anyway, I had all that kind of in the background. But I've always had a love for this noir sort of thing, and it would start as a kid, and it would go through my 20s and 30s and such. And I really wanted to do. I got to a point in my career where I wanted to do it like Doctor Mid-Nite. I wanted to do another large body of work, and I wanted, and it was kind of like I wanted to pull a little bit of what I had done on Doctor Mid-Nite and what I had done on Classics Illustrated, which was adapt. I wanted to do an adaptation, and I wanted to stick with that kind of noir thing, and so it just seemed like I was like, I want to do like a noir adaptation of some sort, and I knew Ted Adams, that at the time was running IDW. And I had started doing work for them, doing covers, and like Phoenix Without Ashes with Harlan, and a number of other licensed products. And at the bottom of it all, I wanted to eventually do a long, like a full size graphic novel.
Yeah.
And they had great success with the Parker books with Darwin Cook.
With Darwin, amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing stuff.
And I think it's important to note here, a lot of people, Darwin was a phenomenal talent, and those books were amazing. But what was really amazing, I don't know if people realize this now, but what's so remarkable about, in addition to so many other things about Darwin's work, was that first Parker book is really, in my mind, I think it's one of the first hardcover mainstream popular graphic novels in terms of the accessibility it had, that was based on just a genre, where it wasn't biographical or where it was something genre related. And it was a mainstream breakout. And it was a hardcover format. And so I think Darwin really is one of the original pioneers of the modern mainstream graphic novel format. When you go to the library and you see all these rows of graphic hardback novels, I really think Parker is one of the key focal points that started all this, So, I
hard agree with you on that point, mate. Big time.
Okay. Yeah. And so I think that he really deserves a lot of credit. Him and Scott Dunbier and the guys that, and Ted and all those guys, and Chris Ryle and all of them that got all together and made this thing happen. So Darwin had done a number of them at that point, and I had spoken with Ted about doing something noir related, and Ted had suggested, I had suggested Lawrence Block to me. He had the ability to get the rights to it, and he had mentioned Matthew Scudder, and I was familiar with Scudder since the 80s, and because that's when he first became very well known. And I thought, and he was like, well, that's something I can do. And I thought, yeah, that's something I'd like to try, And so they kind of left it to me, my editor, Tom Waltz and Chris and Ted, they kind of left it to me to pick which book to do. And so I looked at all the books, and I just, I think Tom was under the initial impression I would just start with the first one. But my thought was, I wanted to make sure that, just in case we do just one of these, at least for starters, to start with the book. And I just kept coming back to 8 Million Ways to Die, which is actually the fifth in the series.
Yeah.
And I just was like, I just don't see any way. I have to do this book. I mean, this has to be the one of the series. And then, I can adapt the others, work around and all that. But to me, this was the starting point, was the 8 Million Ways to Die.
Because it's a transformative moment in Scudder's life, isn't it?
Yes.
8 Million Ways to Die.
Yeah. And it's so funny because, I was like, well, this is the one I want to do. And they were like, I did some sample pages to show to Lawrence's agent and Lawrence. And I was like, oh boy, I hope this all works out. And they came back and said, great. And
because Block was a graphic novel skeptic before you did this book.
Yeah.
And, you've achieved something absolutely major, because I've seen him write numerous words about how he doesn't really get graphic novels prior to working with you on this.
It was funny because I read some interviews with him before online, and I was like, well, one thing I'm not going to do is bother Lawrence,
right.
I was fairly intimidated, to be honest,
Because I don't think I think he might be the one person who on the face of the earth who didn't particularly like Darwin's Parker books. I mean, he's an army of one in that respect, because everybody thinks they're like a work of genius.
I did not know that.
But it might be, not that I've seen him say, I don't like it. I think I might have seen him say, I just don't give a toss about this. It's not my thing.
I think initially he had great skepticism about it until I was finally finished with this and he saw how this turned out. And then that all changed. So, I got the go ahead, and it was it was funny. I remember I got the go ahead. We had a little meeting on the phone, and it was like, okay, and I was like, great, because I was so eager to do, I wanted to do I wanted to take everything I'd learned and, put it into this. And I'll never forget. I remember I went for a walk and I got halfway around the block and I stopped right in the middle of the sidewalk. And I was like, what have I done? I was like, because, the enormity of it suddenly hit. And then I followed that up with, I remember reading, I was working on something else at the time, and it was real late at night. And I was like, I got to start reading this, rereading this. And I read the first 20 pages of the book, and I went and laid down, and then I got back up again. I'm like, I can't stop reading, and I was like, oh my, and it just dawned on me as I got deeper and deeper into it. I'm like, and it was a great feeling, because it was like, this is not going to be like adapting a caper book or, a tough guy book or, people getting, punched through walls or anything like that. This is a book about everything. This is about life, death, addiction, struggle, the human condition, the whole everything, and it's told. It just struck me that this, I know people love the Lawrence Block Scudder series. Yeah. And it's great. There's no doubt about it. But there is something I feel about this book, as you said, that's transformative. I feel like it's a standalone piece. And I feel like it is just, there is something about it that I think is it's just something different. And so that being said, it definitely tuned me in a different direction on, what I was going to be doing with it. But it was really a blessing, because again, I keep coming back to that writing is everything. I mean, you can have great art, movies can have great sets, but it's like, you got to have solid writing. And I think everything it's the foundation that everything can be built on. And the writing in this was so great, and the dialogue was so fantastic that, it was a different kind of playground, so to speak, But it was so challenging, and in such a positive way, in terms of how do I interpret this stuff into the comic format? So it just was the beginning of a long path of figuring out how I was going to tell the story in a comic format. So much like as I told you before, at this point, I was living in a very large old apartment with high ceilings, and I had all these big blank walls. So I was out with the brown mailing paper again. I photocopied the whole book. And I know this sounds funny, but it's like I photocopied the whole book, and I had huge chunks of it up in sections up on the wall, like all four walls. And what I was trying to do was I was trying to get to the heart of what would come out what would come out of looking at all the writing, what would come out visually as the direction to go to in telling the story. And I would underline in red, I would take a ruler and a red Prismacolor and underline what I thought were key points. Well, I started underlining every single sentence. I'm like, this is going to be a 400-page graphic novel. I only had 130 pages to work with. So, it got to be very challenging. But as funny as it sounds, as I had all these pages up on the wall and I kept looking at them, certain paragraphs started pulling themselves out apart from others. And then I started to be able to like connect sections, and I actually started reading up and studying a little bit about like movie adaptations of novels and how they would cut certain characters and certain scenes. And it was a great learning process. And I really learned to respect the art of adaptation. Again, I had done it with the Classics Illustrated, but in this, it's like it's really funny. I've gotten to the point where when I watch a movie that's been adapted from a book, there's adaptation where it works off of the original material. And then there are people trying to duplicate scenes from the book. And it's funny because you can tell, because there'll be a moment in the movie and you're like, why is this happening? It doesn't quite flow with the rest of the movie, but it's because they're trying to do something that's in the book, and it's not a criticism. It's people trying to be faithful. But there are times where it's kind of funny to say this, but by being faithful is sometimes leaving things out.
Yeah.
That
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that process. So really the biggest challenge initially was really getting the actual script put together, getting it to where it fit within 130 pages. And also, certain scenes had to be cut, certain characters had to be cut, and getting it all to where I felt like it had a flow and how I was going to tell the story. And I had the idea to do it in part sequentially and part combination of large images and then large blocks of text, because I wanted it to be not just a comic, but like a book, like where it was like you couldn't just read it in an hour, just flip through it, because I felt like, it's going to cost, a certain amount of money, and it's hardcover, and it's, I wanted people to get their money's worth. I wanted to get them to have something that they could read over a period of time. So I felt like I did not feel constrained in that somebody needs to flip through this. I figured it would be something you'd want to take time with. So
you want to savor. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought about the whole concept of, of trying to stretch out of the format to try to work out the way that the time would pass between the panels, the way time would pass between those blocks of copy with the single illustrations, but at the same time, give it all kind of a flow. And it sounds a little bit vague, but it is kind of a way of trying to merge pictures and pictures and words. And it's not like a movie. I know a lot of people now that I run into, I notice there's a lot of habits. Sometimes people are like, they try to write comic scripts as though they're for movies, or it's like a movie, but movie time and book time are two different times.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So go. Anyway.
Something that I was really struck by with 8 Million Ways to Die is, I think specifically about this point, I think that your handling of time and the temporal elements of telling that story are highly resonant to me. I think the only other person that I've seen do it as well as you do it is in fact the master of that, which is Eisner at his peak between like 46 and 50. During that period of time where it's him and it's Abe Kannigson on the letters, there's some brilliant, experiments about time compression and the pacing that he does. And what you achieved on that level felt very Eisnerian to me. And it was very resonant of that kind of work, if that makes sense to you, John.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a very kind thing to say. I was going to say, going back to my childhood, one of the watermark moments, along with discovering like Walter and Howard's work, was when I saw the first issue of the Warren Spirit on the stand.
Yeah, man, brilliant.
I picked that up, and I first off, again, back then, you didn't know these things were coming out. It just happened to be up on the stands. And I was shocked because I knew about the Spirit from the great comic book heroes by Jules Feiffer and Steranko's History of the Comics. So to see an actual Spirit comic was a shocker. And it was all in black and white. And I took that home, and I must have reread. I just reread it all night. I mean, I was just electrified. And I thought it was one of the greatest. It's still one of the greatest #1 comics I ever picked up. So to me, it was like, this is how it's done. And it's funny because there was only one other time I had kind of an experience like that. Was, again, I was actually not interested in comics all that much. I had just moved out of the house. I was working at the graphic studio, and I was going out to, see the bands and such. And, this idea of doing this comic was still kind of fulminating in the back of my head. But I remember stopping by a 7-Eleven on the way back from going out, and it was late at night, and there was still spinner racks at that time. And again, I wasn't buying any comics. I would pick up an occasional heavy metal, but I wasn't buying any Marvel or DC. But I saw this Daredevil comic in the rack, and it was like it was called The Kingpin Must Die, and it had the giant Kingpin. And I was like, this is not normal. What is this? Right. And I opened it up, and it was a cutaway shot of Daredevil, like tied up in a sewer line, below the city. And it looked like a new wave Will Eisner splash page. And I just bought it on the spot. And it was this moment of this, like, oh, wow, this guy. And that was my first experience of Frank Miller.
Yeah. Right on.
And at that moment, it was like, wow. Again, Frank had that same thing, where he had that sense of time and layout and all that sort of thing. So, that was a big influence on me. And definitely when I was working on this as well, that was another moment. But the thing about working on Lawrence's book is that Lawrence, there's such a delicacy of the human, again, not to be repetitive, but of the human condition and life. And it really hit home to me, the book, the way it was written. I had spent a lot of time in the DC area and around cities, and I'd actually spent a little time in New York. And it really kind of, I thought, hit a nerve about how the city has got a funny pull on people, where it has a tendency to make you feel like you can't be anywhere else. You have to stay in the city, no matter what. No matter how desperate your situation becomes, no matter how hard it is, you cannot leave the city. It is like all that matters. If you leave the city, somehow you'll disappear. You won't survive. So to survive in the city, it's like anything goes. Like by any means necessary, survive the city. So there's this complete moral detachment that comes with surviving in the city to make the ends meet, to stay in the city, And I thought that the book, in the most extreme manner, touched on that. And I thought, that's where this book has so many different levels. And I wanted to kind of get through that too. And I thought it was so. And again, you've got the main character he's completely focused on how dangerous the city is, and he's completely focused on. He's obsessed with reading the newspaper and, about how everybody's dying in various crimes and freak accidents and such. And yet he is completely oblivious to the fact that he's slowly dying from his addiction. Yeah. He's aware of it, but there's this kind of thing where he kind of feels like, it's like somehow by reading these stories, about all these other people's like problems, and again, it's that whole thing of like, well, it's the city. This is how we survive in the city. And I just thought that was so brilliant. And again, that's my interpretation. That might not be exactly what Lawrence had in mind, but that was another element that really appealed in telling the story and all these different characters and such. So.
I think that's fascinating, because I'm really glad you shared that with me, because that really comes through, I think, in your adaptation of the novel. And I think one of the many things I love about it, and it's really illuminating you going through that, because it explains a lot. It explains a lot to me about the final version of the tale that you told. One of the many things I love about the book is your physical representation of Scudder, because the minute I saw your version of Scudder on the page, I thought, that's Matt Scudder straight away. Having been somebody who's read, well, as you know, read all the books, and I think he really coalesced in my mind how he looked. And it's so rare that you see an adaptation of something and somebody manages to come up with almost a recognizable archetype of who this character is, of who a character is, because many PI characters are framed in such a way that it's open to the visual imagination of the reader. That's why, say Hammer, for example, in the Hammer novels never gets facially described. Many of these guys never get described in a way, but your Scudder, as soon as I saw him, I thought, man, you've totally nailed him visually. It was amazing to me. It was kind of a revelation when I opened the book up.
Well, thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. It was funny. When I started the process, Lawrence does not go into a lot of deep description of some of the characters' appearances, so it was kind of open for that. So, I kind of had to cast, the characters, and I had various, little bits and pieces of actors and people that I've known and just like, I would just kind of put it in a blender visually to come up with it. And Scudder was really a challenge. Scudder was a real challenge to me, because there is something about this character where he is not necessarily hard as nails, like a Mike Hammer. He's almost kind of, God, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but kind of almost like kind of a cipher. He kind of he's kind of this character that's there, it's almost like that's in the city. It's almost like he's part of the city, and as Lawrence has said, the city is very much one of the main characters of the book. Yeah. And Scudder is part of the city. But he is not amoral, but he's not necessarily somebody who's going to be knocking people through glass bar walls or glass windows or whatever. So, I was trying to figure out a way to make him look somewhat stern, but at the same time vulnerable, Yeah. And I think one of my visual references at the time was, again, I was thinking of various movie actors from different time periods and such. And I've always kind of liked Richard Widmark, because Richard Widmark has that kind of vulnerability. You got to start off playing these, the scary guy in Kiss of Death or whatever. But as his career went on,
Tommy Udo.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. But as his career went on, he became. I'm thinking specifically of when he played the cop Madigan.
For sure.
Picture. And he's got an edge to him, but he's got a vulnerability to him as well. Yeah. And so, maybe I touched a little bit on that, but the thing I like about the Scudder character is that he's kind of he's very much an enigma, and I think that's one of the things I like about him is that I think that Lawrence keeps his character so kind of open that the reader is able to kind of fill in, what they get out of the character. And I appreciate that you liked my representation of him, because I was definitely trying to get him to be distinctive, but at the same time, somewhat distant,
Well, and I think you achieved that. And I could see from the nature of your illustrations how hard you'd worked on getting on walking that knife blade and getting him in the space that you did. This might seem like a very small detail. Well, it might to somebody listening to this, but it was key for me. I thought you got his hairline just right. Yeah, because he's a man of a certain age. He's not a kid.
Right.
So he's not got a full head of hair, but he's not bald. He's kind of, his hairline felt just right to me. I thought that really was, for me, was the key to how you totally framed his face so well, because it's like, man, he doesn't look too young and virile, but he doesn't look too old and knackered either. He looks he looks convincingly weathered by his experience while still being somebody who can take care of himself.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. I know what you're saying about the detail, but it is funny because, again, I think the character is in his early 40s in this particular. The Scudder, for people who are not aware of the series, Matthew Scudder ages in real time. So he's in his 40s and the 80s, and he ages, through the 90s, 2000s, et cetera. But at this point in the series, he's in his early 40s. So I was trying to visualize where he would be at in his life. He does have a sense of physicality. He does have some strength. And I was trying to get it so he didn't look too young, you know, but I didn't want him to look too haggard either, you know. And so, a lot of times when people are doing detective characters, they have this huge head of hair and
right, exactly,
jutting down the widow's peak, jutting down
right,
almost the bridge of their nose. Right, So, but thanks, and that went on with all the other characters. I was definitely trying to be like, again, it's a comic book at its heart, but at the same time, I did want a sense of reality to how the characters would look, the men and women, and I was trying to visualize, that through little details like and it's funny with Scudder, for example, with the way he dressed, because again, it wasn't something that was very specific in Lawrence's writing. What I was trying to visualize with how he dressed and his hat and his trench coat and all that, what I was trying to get was that he is, he's broken at this point in his life, and his what he's got going on, he's broken, he's really in bad shape, and he's kind of working off of kind of a broken past. He was he was a police detective, and he's had an accident where a young girl got killed in a crossfire. He's left his wife and kids, and he's gone from this kind of like just outside of the city family life to this living in Hell's Kitchen and kind of broken down. And he's really kind of on his last legs at this point in the book series. So I was kind of visualizing that at this point, he was wearing like what he would used to wear when he was a detective on the force in the late 70s. So he's wearing like his police outfit, the hat and the coat, because it's almost like it's all that he's got left is this memory. And actually, and again, talking about hairlines and details and such, if you'll notice, when you get to the end of the book and he has his moment of clarity, when the case is over and he has his moment of clarity, he's not wearing the hat anymore for the rest of the book. It's like the hat is off, and and I know it's like a little thing, but my hope is to eventually do more books in the series, but he would not be wearing the hat anymore after.
Yeah.
And again, it's a little thing, but it's just like that was part of his past, and he's realized that it's far, far past him, and to let go.
Yeah.
So.
I love the amount of detail that you've put into that, and I really feel it as well. I really, as a big fan of the character, as I say, your adaptation really spoke to me. In terms of if you would like to adapt other Scudder novels, what would be at the top of your list?
Well, my idea would be, and I've had this for some time now, is I would like to do the adaptations. I mean, it would be great to do all of them.
Of course, yeah.
But I had a specific idea to do them in sets of 3.
Yeah.
And the first set would be I would really like to follow him through different periods in his life.
Yeah.
And not just him, but New York City.
Yeah.
So this book, 8 Million Ways to Die, is 1982. It's Scudder in 1982, New York. And then I would like to follow that up with Everybody Dies.
Which is
1998 New York.
Yeah.
And this is where, he's, and that is, there's a lot of things about, he is just entering his 60s.
Yeah.
And he is coming to terms with, he feels like he has, gone from this incredibly chaotic life he had in 8 Million Ways to Die. he's settled down. He's still working all these incredibly violent cases, as you know, because that's his job. But he's married. You know, he feels like a sense of, you know, of I don't know if complacency is the right word, but everything's kind of settled. Yeah. You know, he's instead of being unlicensed, he's got his detective license. Yeah. So everything is kind of set in place, and it's all like kind of. It also hooks into, you know, his recovery that he's come from this first book. So what I find interesting about it, Everybody Dies, is all that is taken away. Yeah. You know, he loses some major characters in his life. I don't want to give it all away. He loses a lot of major characters in life, and he is challenged with whether or not he is going to keep his license in order to continue forward in his mission, as it were. And if that's a necessity, and I love that. I love the idea. And again, I love this about Lawrence's work is that it's got a moral base to it, but the moral base sometimes goes outside of the lines of, you know, the law. Yeah. I think that's you know, this is a thing that, you know, it's a really interesting area to tread. So I like that conflict is in there. And then in Drop of the Hard Stuff would be the third book. So it'd be, and Drop was the last full novel that he did with Scudder. And that's post 9/11, and it's him coming into his 70s and his late 70s at that time. And it's got a lot, and actually most of that book is a flashback to the first year anniversary after. So to me, it would be like a full circle.
Yeah, you know, right on.
That it would come. I have really thought about that, and I thought they would make a great trilogy, the 3 books together. So you would have 8 Million Ways to Die, Everybody Dies, and then A Drop of the Hard Stuff. So I do have a specific.
I love that outline, and I can absolutely understand why you've put that together. I think your thinking creatively is very clear there, and I really hope that you get the chance to do it. Because I was thinking in my mind, what would I like to see you do? And came up with 2 completely different answers, which is...
Well, which ones are you interested in?
So in terms of, I think books that I think might be a challenge to adapt, but if you got it right, I think with your style and your take on the character, you could do really well, is I would like to see you adapt When the Sacred Gin Mill Closes, which is a very interesting. That's an immediate flashback novel after he sobers up to his drink, and it goes back to his drinking days. Just because it's such an interesting story about the pernicious effect of alcohol and drinking culture and all that kind of stuff, in amid all the violence and the meta story that's going on. I really love that book. I also really love A Long Line of Dead Men. I think that's a very interesting story. But I mean, I can't beat your plan. I think your plan is absolutely right. But at the point where you before you stop adapting these novels, if I was going to be selfish, I'd go, I'd love to see you do When the Sacred Gin Mill Closes and A Long Line of Dead Men. I love both of those books.
I'll have to look into Long Line of Dead Men, and Sacred Gin Mill is like right there. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like in fact, that is somewhere in between. Maybe that would be one of the first 3, or that would be the first of the second set of 3. So it's like, believe me, it's a real.
I mean, it's a great book. I think if you've not read it, you really enjoy it. Long Line of Dead Men.
I love it. I love it. I think it's, again, just like 8 Million Ways to Die. And I have not read Long Line of Dead Men. I have read quite a few of them. I will check that out. But again, when the Sacred Gin Mill Closes, that is a deep book. To me.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a lot of things in there. And I think I think you'll agree with me. You really get into, that book really gets into, I thought that book was really a deep thing about friendships and
for sure.
And how friendships go bad. And I thought it was very, very personal. And again, it's real. I mean, it's like, that book feels very real. Those people feel very real. And the interactions they have with each other feel very real and very, very much particular to that environment, New York City in that period, I think. Yeah. So I agree. That would be a great one to do.
Yeah.
So I definitely look up this other one too.
Oh, Long Line of Dead Men, you'll enjoy that, mate. And it's got a very, very interesting plot. And one that kind of affects Scudder's life kind of moving forward in a particular kind of way. Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. And to close out on this discussion of your beautiful adaptation of 8 Million Ways to Die, to do all that work and then to have it to be so positively received with almost wall to wall rave reviews, and for it to be embraced by Block himself, and then to partner up with Block doing your signings and what have you, that must have felt amazing, mate.
It was, it's indescribable. I mean, it really was. I'll tell you, it was funny. I really didn't want to bother Lawrence while I was working on this. I was like, I had felt like I've got to do what I can on this. And I felt like I had done the book fairly well, but I was like, he's busy with what it is he's doing. I'm going to work on this. And I got it all done, and we got it through the letter. And I'll never forget this. It was really funny. My editor was like, it was a Friday, and he contacted me and he's like, well, we've sent it off to Lawrence. And I was like, oh, great. And, I was really excited. And about 15 minutes later, I was like, oh my God, what if he doesn't like it? I was like, it never even occurred to me. Right. And I thought, and I got this just huge dread, like, oh my God, and it just was the funniest feeling, because I had gotten so caught up in the adaptation, and I thought, oh yeah, Lawrence is going to what's he going to think, and it was a long weekend, man. Because it was like, I sent it out on Friday, and, I tried not to think about it. But then Sunday morning, I'll never forget this. It was Sunday morning, and I got a friend request from Lawrence. And it was just, my heart kind of jumped a little bit. And then, Lawrence speaks very, very briefly. It's a very short sentence. And I was like, well, I hope you enjoyed it. And he's like, said something along the lines, I thought it was brilliant. And it was just the biggest exhale in my adult life, just kind of like, oh. And then, he suggested the signing at Mysterious Bookshop in New York, and then set up the thing with Midtown. And so, going, actually, what was so funny about it is I hadn't been to New York in a long time. I had spent a good amount of time there around 1999, 2000. And I had only been up there once or twice, and I had not been up there for almost a decade. I think it had been. So, I drove up there, and I realized it was so funny, because I had gotten so deep into the research and reference and drawing New York City that it was almost eerie to be walking on the streets of the city, because I've been drawing it for so long, But the fact is that to not only be walking the streets of New York again after finishing the book, but actually going to the Mysterious Otto Penzler store, which is this really world-renowned bookstore. And then
Absolutely.
Lawrence showed up and Lawrence was there, his daughters were there, and they were so nice and gracious, and Lawrence was so kind that it really was an amazing experience. It really was. And I'll never forget, after we did the signing, we were going to, let's see, I can't remember where I was getting to. I needed to ride the subway. And Lawrence was like, well, that's the same line I'm going on. And so I ended up on the subway with Lawrence, which was just, him and I were standing together. And there's a photo, actually, a buddy that was with us took the photo. But it was so funny, because I had spent so much time drawing Scudder sitting in the subway, down and out in like 1982 New York. And it never occurred to me that Lawrence and I would be together, talking a little bit, about the project, literally on the New York subway. So it was really a neat moment. So all of that has been really great. And I've been very fortunate, because, I've met a couple of really neat people through the mystery, like mystery writers. Like Wallace Strobe was there that night. Yeah, who's a fantastic writer. And he's talked to me about doing some things with his character. And also I did a Murder of Go-Go's benefit mystery book with the Holly West was the editor on that. And we've gotten to know each other, and I have to say, it's really opened up a world of new friends and acquaintances. So I'm very, very grateful. And really, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Lawrence embraced it so much, and talks about it so well, and then invited me back on board with Subterranean Press to do the cover for the Scudder short story collection, Night in the Music, which is coming out in the fall.
which just looks so beautiful, mate. It really does.
Thanks. So I feel really blessed in all of this, and I'm really grateful to the guys at IDW, my editor and Ted and Chris and everyone, for giving me the opportunity, to do this book right, so I am eternally grateful. And, I have to say, I'm so grateful that we were able to get this out and promote it and, and all that. So it's all been a very, very good experience for sure. So
that's wonderful. And no better place to close out, actually, John, than on all the positive impact that amazing piece of work has had. I can't wait for that edition of Night in the Music, which I already own in its original version, but I have undoubtedly pre-ordered the new version. I can't wait. And I'm just so glad you're in this space. I can't wait to see what you do with Lawrence's material next. And I can't wait to see what you're working on next. And thanks so much for giving up this time for our conversation. I have really enjoyed it, mate.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm flattered to be a part of your show. And I just really, it's great to be able to talk about all this. And thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.
You've been listening to Hard Agree. This episode was edited by John Horsley and Kenrick Regan, and our theme music, Golden, was written and performed for this show by Liverpool's finest band, Denio. Hard Agree is a production of the Spoilerverse and myself, Andrew Sumner.